Chapter 1. The Wounded Stranger. The cold wind howled through the towering trees of the dense, mist-covered forest, rattling their limbs and sending an eerie whisper through the leaves. Ethan had grown accustomed to the harsh conditions of the wilderness, the damp chill that hung in the air like an ever-present shadow, the faint rustling of creatures hiding in the underbrush. The forest had always been his sanctuary, a place of solitude where the noise of the modern world faded into nothingness, replaced by the unspoken language of nature. He had been a forest ranger for more than a decade, roaming the vast expanses of the land, ensuring the trails were safe for hikers, the rivers clear, and the wildlife undisturbed. The days bled together in an endless cycle of routine, and it was easy to forget that life existed beyond the confines of the woods. But that day, as Ethan made his way through a particularly dense stretch of trees near the northern ridge, something unusual caught his eye. He was walking along the narrow trail, his boots crunching on the frost-covered ground, when he spotted a flash of movement just beyond the tree line. At first, he thought it was an animal, perhaps a deer or a fox, but as he drew closer, the figure became clearer. It wasn't any animal he had seen before. The figure was hunched over, struggling to move through the thick brush. Something about the way it moved made his instincts flare. It was hurt. Ethan's heart raced as he quickened his pace, stepping over fallen branches and rocks with the ease of someone who had spent more time in the forest than in any building. His hand instinctively went to the knife on his belt, not out of fear, but out of caution. The forest was unpredictable. The wild could be dangerous, and anything, even a wounded animal, could become a threat if cornered or in pain. As he drew closer, however, he realized the figure wasn't an animal at all. It was a woman, or at least, it appeared to be a woman. She was lying on the ground, her body half hidden by the underbrush, blood trickling from what appeared to be a deep wound in her side. The pale blue skin of her arms and face gave off a faint, almost ethereal glow, unlike anything Ethan had ever seen before. Her hair, long and silver white, was matted with dirt and blood, her breathing shallow and uneven. She was dressed in clothing that was unlike anything from Earth, a strange, metallic fabric that shimmered in the dull light of the forest, as if it had been forged from some otherworldly material. His mind raced as he knelt beside her, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. This wasn't just a human woman, it wasn't even a woman from Earth. She was something else entirely. His first thought was that she was a victim of some kind of crash or conflict, but that didn't explain the unmistakable alien features, the glowing skin, or the otherworldly attire. Ethan's heart beat faster, his mind racing as he took in her form, trying to assess her injuries. She had been clearly abandoned, left alone in the wild to die. The blood loss was severe, and her body seemed to be slipping in and out of consciousness. As he touched her shoulder, he felt the tremors of her body, the faint shiver of life still clinging to her. He couldn't leave her here. He had to help, no matter how bizarre the situation had become. His training kicked in. He quickly scanned the area, ensuring that there was no immediate danger. The forest seemed eerily quiet, as if holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Carefully, Ethan moved her into a more comfortable position, checking her pulse. It was weak, but steady. She was still alive, barely. He didn't have much time. The cold was seeping into her, slowing her body's natural ability to heal. He had to get her out of the woods and back to his cabin, his only chance of saving her. It took every ounce of his strength to lift her, her body limp and unresponsive in his arms. Her weight was nothing like what he had imagined. She was far lighter than a human of her size should have been, her limbs almost delicate under his grip. Ethan adjusted his hold, cradling her in his arms as he turned to head back to his cabin. The journey would be difficult, especially with the terrain, but there was no time to waste. Each step seemed like an eternity as he fought to keep his focus, his gaze flicking to the mysterious woman in his arms. She was a mystery, an alien, perhaps, stranded in a place she didn't belong. And yet, the human part of him couldn't help but feel sympathy, a deep-rooted desire to protect her, to ensure that she made it through whatever ordeal she had suffered. The forest, usually so comforting in its isolation, now seemed foreboding, its dark corners and shadowed paths holding the unknown. Every noise, every rustle of a leaf or the snap of a twig made him tense. He couldn't help but wonder who or what had left her there, wounded and alone. What had happened to her? Why was she here? The walk back to his cabin felt like an eternity. The woman in his arms remained eerily still, her breathing shallow and labored. The alien markings on her skin shimmered faintly in the low light, and Ethan couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he was in over his head. He wasn't a doctor, and he certainly wasn't equipped to handle something like this. His cabin, for all its comforts, was hardly a hospital, but it was the best he could offer, and at this moment, that had to be enough. By the time he reached the small wooden cabin nestled against the edge of the forest, night had fully fallen, and the world outside seemed to grow colder. The wind whipped through the trees, sending a chilling breeze across his skin as he carefully carried the woman inside. He moved quickly, setting her down gently on his bed, his eyes flicking over the alien fabric of her clothes as he set to work. The first priority was stopping the bleeding, but the wound on her side was unlike anything he had ever seen before. There was no way to know how her biology worked, no way to know what kind of care she needed. But he couldn't just leave her. He had to try. He rummaged through the small supplies he kept in his first aid kit, trying to find something, anything, that could help. There was no obvious infection at least, none that he could recognize, but the blood loss was severe, and she needed immediate medical attention. But where could he take her? This wasn't the kind of thing that could be handled by a local clinic or hospital. Whatever had happened to her had happened far beyond the reach of anything he knew. As he worked to stabilize her, his mind kept wandering back to the same thought. What was she? Who was she? And what had brought her here, to this tiny corner of Earth, alone and dying? The storm outside picked up, and the wind howled through the cracks in the wooden cabin. Ethan worked tirelessly through the night, applying pressure to the wound and doing everything he could to stem the blood loss. By dawn, her breathing had steadied, though she remained unconscious. Her skin, once pale and lifeless, had taken on a slightly healthier hue, but there was still so much about her that he didn't understand. The days that followed were a blur of caring for her, watching over her, trying to learn what he could about her condition. Her recovery was slow, but with each passing day, she seemed to improve. Her strength returned gradually, her eyes fluttering open from time to time, though she never spoke. The mystery of who she was, where she had come from, and what had happened to her lingered in the back of Ethan's mind. But as he sat by her side, watching her rest, he found that his thoughts were no longer dominated by fear or uncertainty. The bond between them, though still fragile, was undeniable. There was something about her that drew him in, something about the alien woman that resonated deep within him. But the questions remained. How could he help her? What was her purpose here on Earth? And most importantly, what did all of this mean for the future? The days passed in a haze of uncertainty and quiet determination. Ethan spent every waking moment caring for the alien woman, the strange creature who had appeared out of the mist of the wilderness, injured and alone. Despite the small cabin's lack of proper medical facilities, he had done what he could. Her breathing had become less labored, and her skin had regained some color, but the mystery of her existence, of her origin, hung heavy in the air. He had seen many things during his years in the forest, but never anything like this. The alien markings on her skin shimmered under the faint light of the cabin, the patterns unlike anything he had ever encountered. The more he studied her, the more questions he had. What was she? What had brought her here, to this remote corner of the Earth? But these questions would have to wait. For now, all he could do was help her recover, offering whatever comfort and care he could. When she awoke for the first time, her gaze was unfocused, her amber-colored eyes wide with confusion and fear. Ethan had been sitting beside her, keeping a watchful eye on her condition, when her eyelids fluttered and she slowly stirred. "You're safe," he whispered, his voice calm and reassuring. "You're safe here." She blinked at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to make sense of him, of her surroundings. There was a flicker of recognition, but it was brief, as though she had yet to process where she was. Ethan wasn't sure how to proceed. Would she understand him? Would she speak? But she remained silent, her gaze still locked on him. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind outside, howling softly against the cabin, and the quiet crackle of the fire in the hearth. Then, to his surprise, she whispered something in a language he couldn't understand, her voice strained and weak, as if the words were foreign even to her. Her lips moved again, slower this time, and this time, he caught the one word that stood out above the others. "Help," she murmured, her voice barely audible, as if speaking took all her remaining energy. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. She was asking for help. But what did she need? What could he do for her beyond tending to her wounds and offering her the most basic of comforts? He bent closer, his hand resting gently on hers, careful not to startle her. "I'm helping," he said softly. "You're going to be okay." He didn't know if that was true, but it was the only thing he could say. He needed her to believe it, for both their sakes. Her eyes closed briefly, exhaustion overtaking her, and he could see the faintest hint of a tear glistening in the corner of her eye. She was scared and confused. He had no way of knowing how long she had been out there, alone and injured. He couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt for not being able to do more. This creature, this alien woman, had come to him for protection, for care, and all he could offer her was this small, quiet cabin in the middle of nowhere. He wasn't a hero. He was just a man who had always lived in isolation, who had never expected his life to take such a dramatic turn. As the days wore on, the woman's strength began to return, though she remained silent. She didn't speak in the strange language again, but her eyes followed him whenever he moved around the cabin, and she occasionally made small, almost imperceptible gestures, as if trying to communicate. Ethan wasn't sure if she understood his words, but he found himself talking to her nonetheless. He told her about his life in the woods, his work as a ranger, the long hours spent alone, watching the seasons change. In a strange way, it felt comforting to speak to someone, even if she couldn't respond. One afternoon, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow across the sky, the woman finally moved. She sat up in the bed, her hands trembling as she adjusted her position, clearly still weak but determined. Ethan rushed over to her, worried that she might overexert herself, but she held up a hand, signaling for him to stop. Her eyes, still clouded with confusion, locked onto his, and for the first time since her arrival, she spoke again. "Where am I?" Her voice was low, rough from disuse, but it was undeniably human. The words were in perfect English, and Ethan blinked in surprise, unsure of how to respond. She could understand him. "You're safe," he said, his voice steady, though inside, he was far from sure. "You're in my cabin. I found you injured in the woods." She looked around, taking in the room for the first time, her gaze sweeping over the simple furnishings, the warmth of the fire in the hearth. The flicker of recognition passed through her eyes, and then, without warning, she collapsed back onto the bed, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "You're hurt," Ethan said urgently, rushing to her side, but she shook her head weakly, her eyes fluttering closed. "No," she murmured, barely audible. "Not that." She let out a shuddering breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was tinged with something deep and sad. "I'm lost." Ethan's chest tightened as he sat down beside her, his mind racing. Lost? What did that mean? Lost to what? To who? She was obviously not from Earth. That much was clear, but how had she ended up here? Who was she? And why had she been alone and wounded in the wild? Her hand reached out, trembling, and Ethan took it gently in his, giving her a reassuring squeeze. He had so many questions, but he didn't want to overwhelm her. She had already been through so much. "Do you remember what happened?" he asked quietly. Her eyes flickered open, meeting his, and there was something in her gaze, something that conveyed both fear and determination, as if she were searching for a way to explain the unfathomable. "I don't remember much," she said, her voice strained. "I was taken. Then I ran." She paused, her eyes glazing over as if the memory itself caused her pain. "I ran from them. But they found me." The word struck Ethan hard. She had been taken. Taken by who? What kind of beings could do such a thing, and why? The questions spiraled through his mind, but for the moment, he simply held her hand, trying to offer comfort. "You're safe now," he said again, not knowing what else to say. "You're not alone anymore." Her fingers tightened around his, and for the first time since she had come to him, she seemed to relax, if only slightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for saving me." Chapter 2. The Unlikely Bond. The days that followed were a blur of uncertain recovery and quiet tension. The woman who still had not told him her name remained mostly in bed, only getting up to eat or drink when prompted by Ethan. Her injuries had healed considerably, but the trauma she had experienced was evident in the haunted look in her eyes. Though she could not or would not speak much about her past, Ethan learned small things about her in the quiet moments. The way she flinched at certain sounds, the way she tensed whenever the wind howled through the trees, as though expecting someone or something to come for her at any moment. It was clear she had been through something terrible, something far beyond what he could understand. But in the space between her moments of silence, something shifted. She was beginning to trust him, and with that trust came a slow but steady connection between them. There was something about her, something fragile yet unyielding, that intrigued Ethan, pulling him in with an intensity he hadn't expected. As the days passed, he began to wonder just how far this strange bond would take them, what it could mean for both of them. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the woman finally spoke again, her voice stronger now, but still filled with uncertainty. "What is your name?" she asked, her eyes locking onto his. The question, though simple, was a revelation. She had finally acknowledged him as something more than a caretaker, more than a stranger. "My name is Ethan," he said, surprised by the warmth that filled him at the sound of his own name, spoken by someone who had no reason to know it. "Ethan Michaels." She nodded slowly, as if committing it to memory. Then, after a long pause, she added, I'm not from here. I'm not from Earth." He nodded, his chest tightening with the knowledge that she was indeed not of this world. Her alien nature was becoming less and less of a mystery. The fabric of her clothing, the glow of her skin, the otherworldly features, everything about her screamed that she was something more than human. Yet, in this small cabin, with the crackle of the fire warming the room, she felt, in many ways, so human. Her emotions, her vulnerability, her very presence made her seem just like anyone else, someone he could care for, someone he could protect. "You don't have to be alone anymore," Ethan said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I can help you. I don't know what happened to you, or why you're here, but I can help." She looked at him, her gaze softening, and for the first time, she smiled, just the faintest curve of her lips, but it was enough to make Ethan's heart skip a beat. The fire crackled softly, casting its warm glow across the small cabin. The woman, still nameless in his mind, sat beside Ethan, her posture slowly relaxing, though the tension in her eyes remained. She had been through so much. Whatever had brought her here, to this desolate place, was something she couldn't fully explain, or perhaps didn't want to. But Ethan felt the weight of her pain, the subtle signs that she carried secrets darker than he could comprehend. Even so, he wanted to help her, to make her feel safe in a world that had treated her so harshly. She had been so silent before, her thoughts seemingly locked away from him. But now, as the flickering flames of the fire reflected in her large amber eyes, Ethan realized that there was something more to her, something deeper that made her feel more human than alien. It was the way she spoke, the way her emotions were painted across her face, raw and genuine. She was a stranger, a mystery wrapped in the unknown, but there was no denying the growing connection between them. "I want to understand," Ethan said, breaking the silence that had settled between them. He wasn't sure if he meant the forest, her alien origins, or their bond. Maybe it was all of it. She turned her head to look at him, her eyes flicking between the fire and his face, as if measuring the sincerity in his words. She opened her mouth, hesitated, then spoke, her voice soft, almost fragile. "I'm not sure where I'm from," she confessed, her voice catching in her throat. I remember my people, but everything is a blur. The memory is fading, or maybe it was never there in the first place. All I know is I'm not from here, and I wasn't supposed to be alone." Ethan could sense the vulnerability in her words, the unspoken grief that lingered behind them. Whatever had happened to her, it was clear that it had left scars deeper than the ones visible on her skin. She was broken, lost, but somehow, there was something about her that clung to hope. "Who did this to you?" he asked gently, leaning forward as he spoke, his voice low and comforting. He didn't expect her to answer. He didn't even know why he asked. Perhaps it was his need to know, to understand. Maybe it was his need to help her heal. She closed her eyes for a moment, the sorrow from her past heavy in the silence. She took a deep breath before speaking again, her voice shaky but firm. "They're called the Draxians. They came to my world, they attacked. Took us." She paused, her gaze becoming distant. "I was captured. They dash," her voice trembled, and she stopped herself, blinking away the mist that clouded her eyes. "I don't know why they let me go. Maybe they thought I was dead, or maybe they just didn't care." Ethan's heart twisted at the rawness of her words. The Draxians, whoever they were, had come, destroyed her world, and taken her. It was something out of a nightmare. His mind struggled to process everything she was telling him. She was an alien, yes, but her pain, her isolation, was something any human could relate to. And in that moment, Ethan knew one thing for certain: he wasn't just offering her help. He was offering her a future. "I won't let them hurt you again," Ethan said, his voice filled with quiet determination. The woman's eyes softened as she met his gaze, but something in her expression changed. A flicker of doubt, or maybe fear, flashed across her face. She took a breath, as though contemplating the weight of his words. She wasn't sure if she could trust him yet, not fully. And how could she? Her life had been torn apart by those she couldn't fight, and now, here was this human someone she didn't know telling her he would protect her. It was almost too much for her to believe, yet the warmth in his eyes and the sincerity in his voice made her wonder if, just for a moment, there could be a new beginning. "I don't know how to repay you," she whispered, the vulnerability in her voice almost breaking him. "I'm not sure I'm worth saving." Ethan moved closer, his hand gently brushing hers in a comforting gesture. "You don't have to repay me," he said firmly. "You don't have to prove anything. Just being here, with me, is enough." For the first time since she had woken, the woman allowed herself to relax, a faint, almost imperceptible smile tugging at her lips. It was fragile, uncertain, but it was there. It was a step forward. Ethan didn't know what had happened to her, or what the future would hold. But as he looked at her, sitting there by the fire, he realized something that took him by surprise. He didn't want her to leave. He didn't just want to help her survive. He wanted to be with her. He had never expected to feel such an overwhelming need to protect someone, to keep them close. But there it was, creeping into his thoughts as she leaned against him, the warmth of her body seeping into his, giving him a comfort he hadn't known he was missing. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt his heart stir with something more than the usual isolation and quiet longing he had known for so many years in the forest. He wanted to offer her more than just shelter. He wanted to offer her a future. And in that fleeting moment, as the fire crackled softly between them, he knew it was more than just survival. He was falling for her. Chapter 3: A Future Uncertain. The days that followed were filled with quiet companionship. The woman who had finally introduced herself as Lyra spent her time recovering, though much of her past remained a mystery to both of them. Her memories were hazy, fragmented, as though the trauma she had endured had stripped away her connection to everything she had once known. But with each passing day, her strength grew, and with it, the bond between her and Ethan solidified. They shared stories of their lives, of the worlds they had come from. Ethan had grown up in the forests, isolated from the bustle of the cities, learning the ways of nature and the rhythms of the wild. Lyra had once known the warmth of family, the connection to her people, though those memories were now lost in the void of her exile. They spoke of Earth and the places she could never have imagined, of her home, which she could barely remember. But there was comfort in their shared solitude. In a way, they were both lost separated from the world they once knew. Despite the safety Ethan offered, Lyra remained cautious. She could feel her past pressing against her, the threat of the Draxians looming in the distance. She hadn't told him everything yet, not about how she had been marked, not about the way the Draxians' fleet had ravaged her planet, leaving nothing but ruins and memories. She couldn't bring herself to speak of it all. The weight of it was too much. But Ethan, in his kindness and patience, had earned her trust. She felt something stir in her, an unfamiliar warmth, a sense of belonging she had never known before. Ethan, too, struggled with the pull he felt toward her. He had always been alone, content in his solitude. But now, with Lyra in his life, he realized how much he had been missing. There was something about her that drew him in, something beyond her beauty and alien features. It was the vulnerability she carried, the fragility of her spirit, that called to him. It was a bond he couldn't ignore, no matter how improbable it seemed. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the fire crackled softly in the hearth, Lyra looked up at Ethan, her eyes soft and searching. There was something in her gaze, a question, a yearning that she hadn't voiced until now. "You've been kind to me, Ethan," she said quietly, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "You've given me a chance to survive, to live. But I need to know something. Do you really want to help me? Or is this just out of obligation?" Ethan's heart clenched at her words. He had been struggling with the same question himself. What was he feeling for her? Was it just the desire to protect, or was it something deeper, something more than simple duty? As he gazed into her amber eyes, the truth became clear. "I want to help you, Lyra," he said, his voice low but steady. "I don't just want you to survive. I want you to live, here with me." Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, He saw the flicker of hope in her eyes, followed by the shadow of fear. She was afraid to believe him, afraid to hope again, after everything she had lost. "You want me here?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan nodded, his heart in his throat. "Yes, I don't know what's ahead, but I want to be with you. I want to protect you. I don't want you to be alone anymore." And in that moment, as the firelight danced in their eyes and the world outside seemed to fade away, they both knew that something had changed. There was no going back. They were bound together now, not by circumstance, but by choice. A future once uncertain had now become a shared reality, fragile and uncertain, but full of possibility. The air between them grew heavy with unspoken words, the fire casting a warm glow on their faces as the wind howled outside, echoing the uncertainty that filled the room. Lyra's eyes searched Ethan's face, as if looking for the truth in his words, needing reassurance that what he said was more than just fleeting kindness. Ethan, too, felt the weight of the moment, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never been one to speak of his feelings, to open up about the things that made him vulnerable. But in that instant, with Lyra standing in front of him, her gaze so intense, he knew there was no turning back. "I don't know what I can offer you, Lyra," Ethan said, his voice rough but steady. "But I promise you that you won't be alone anymore. I want to be with you. I don't care about the past, about where you came from. You're here now." And he hesitated, unsure of how to continue. He wasn't used to being this open, this raw. But something about her, the way she had looked at him in those early moments, had made him realize that he couldn't deny it any longer. "I want you here, with me." Her breath hitched, and for a moment, she remained silent, her amber eyes locked onto his. There was a vulnerability in her gaze, something that seemed to reach out to him in ways that words never could. She wasn't sure if she could trust him, if she could let herself believe in this quiet, simple life he was offering her. There had been so much loss in her life already, so much betrayal. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope, as fragile and fleeting as it was. "I don't know if I can," she whispered, her voice breaking. "After everything, how do I trust again?" Ethan's heart ached at her words, at the fear that still held her. She had been through too much, faced too much loss to just let it go. But he couldn't give up on her, not now, not when he could see the fragile thread of hope in her eyes. "You don't have to trust me all at once," he said softly, stepping closer. "You can take your time. I'm not asking you to forget what you've been through, Lyra. I just want to be here for you, to give you a choice." She looked down at her hands, the alien markings on her skin still visible under the flickering firelight. She didn't know how to move forward, but she could feel something stirring inside her, a deep yearning for peace, for a life not defined by pain and isolation. Ethan's words were the first thing she had heard in a long time that didn't feel like an empty promise or a fleeting comfort. His sincerity was real, and maybe, just maybe, she could believe in it. With a shaky breath, she reached out to him, her hand trembling slightly. "I want to try," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to try to believe." Ethan's heart swelled at her words, and without hesitation, he took her hand in his, gently pulling her close. There were no grand gestures, no promises that could erase the past or guarantee the future. But in that quiet moment, in the warmth of the cabin and the flicker of the fire, there was something more important than anything else. The beginning of a shared path, one where neither of them would have to walk alone. Chapter 4. A New Beginning. The days that followed were filled with an unfamiliar sense of calm. Ethan and Lyra began to settle into a new routine, one that was fragile, uncertain, but full of possibility. They worked together in the small cabin, doing simple things, cooking meals, tending the fire, and, in the quiet moments, talking. Sometimes they spoke of the past, of the things that had shaped them, the losses they had endured, but most often, they spoke of the present, of the life they were building together, however uncertain it might be. Lyra, though still cautious, began to trust Ethan more with each passing day. She started to share pieces of her past, fragments of memories that had once seemed too painful to revisit. She told him of her home, of the planet she had been taken from, of the people who had once welcomed her, loved her, and then lost it all to the Draxians. She spoke of the cold, heartless invasion that had ravaged her world, and of the loneliness that had followed in the wake of that destruction. But even in the darkest parts of her story, there was something resilient in her voice, a strength that Ethan could feel in his bones. For his part, Ethan listened. He didn't try to fix things. He didn't try to rush her healing. He simply listened, offering what comfort he could, and in doing so, he began to understand her more deeply than he could have ever imagined. As the weeks passed, Lyra's strength grew, not just physically, but emotionally. She began to laugh again, a sound so beautiful and rare that it almost felt like a gift. And though there were still moments of pain, moments when she would withdraw into herself, Ethan was there. He never pushed her. He simply gave her space when she needed it, and comfort when she sought it. One evening, as they sat on the porch of the cabin, watching the stars twinkle above them, Lyra turned to him. Her expression was soft, contemplative. "Ethan," she began, her voice steady. "Do you ever wonder what happens next?" Ethan met her gaze, his heart beating a little faster as he realized that the question was as much about him as it was about her. They had been living in this peaceful isolation for so long, trying to forget the world beyond the forest. But it was impossible to ignore forever. They both knew that their future was uncertain, that the Draxians could return, that nothing was guaranteed. But for the first time, as he looked at her, Ethan felt that the future didn't matter as much as the present. "I don't know what's coming, Lyra," he said quietly, "but I do know that I want you here, with me. And whatever happens, we'll face it together." She reached for his hand, her touch gentle but strong. Her eyes softened, and for the first time since she had arrived, she allowed herself to fully believe in what he was offering. Not just safety, not just survival, but something more, a life. A life they could build together, despite the uncertainties ahead. "I want that too," she said, her voice filled with a warmth that made Ethan's chest swell. "I don't know what the future holds, but I want to face it with you, if you'll have me." Ethan smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in years. He took her hand in his, squeezing it gently. "I've always wanted you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I will have you. Always." In that moment, under the vast expanse of the night sky, they both knew that the future, whatever it held, would be theirs to navigate together. No longer alone, no longer lost. And though the world outside their small cabin might still be filled with danger and uncertainty, they had something that no one could take from them. They had each other. And that was enough.